What is up, y'all? Welcome to another episode of FitBizU. I'm your host, Jill Coleman, and today we are going to be getting started, and I want to share with you guys some lessons today that I got from my very first business mentor. So some of you have heard me tell a story before. My first business mentor was Rachel Cosgrove. She's married to Alan Cosgrove. They are OGs within the fitness industry, and I remember it was late 2011. And at that point, JillFit had been in business for about a year and a half. And we had grown our one-on-one coaching offer to the point where we had myself and 5 other coaches, and everyone was sort of maxed out with coaching. Now, again, this is a really good problem to have, but I was at the point where I needed to scale. And maybe you have found yourself in a similar situation where you feel a little bit stuck and you don't really know exactly what the next step is. In fact, whenever I do sales calls or I do chemistry calls with people, this is sort of like the number one thing they say is like, hey, I've gotten myself to a point. I just don't know where to go from here. I feel like I'm stuck in the business. I'm not sure exactly how to grow this thing. I feel like I'm in a holding pattern, and that's exactly where I found myself. And this is always the best time to seek out a coach because remember, the coach can see things that you potentially can't. They've obviously been somewhere that you haven't been yet. They can open up their playbook and they can pull that back. And so when I worked with Rachel, it was a $10,000 investment. And at the time I was, JillFit was making 6 figures, but because I had 5 coaches, I was paying a lot of that out. So technically, yes, we were at 6 figures, but to me, a $10,000 investment when up until that point, I think maybe the biggest investment I made was like $500, maybe $1,000. It was quite an investment. I didn't even have the money. I didn't even have a credit card that went up to that. And so I remember when I reached out to her and she gave me that price point, I remember saying what most people do, which is, oh, I'll get back to you, right? I'll get back to you, knowing full well, like it just was going to be a no-go. However, a couple weeks went by and nothing was changing and I was feeling really frustrated. It was towards the end of the year, 2011, and I didn't want to go into 2012 not knowing how to scale this thing and how to start really like taking this business seriously. We had gotten to a point at JillFit, luckily, that on our own sort of merit and being good trainers and having great content, but I wasn't a business, I didn't know anything about business. I wasn't a business expert at that point. So when I reached out to Rachel, and she told me about the investment, I went ahead and figured out a way to launch a brand new product to make the money to afford it. Now, the product itself was a year-long mentorship. I'd never done anything like this before. And I said, let me see if I can get 12 people to give me $100 a month for 12 months. Now, this is a long-term commitment. It was a little bit harder to sell, but at this point, JillFit had grown a pretty significant and loyal readership to where I was able to get 14 people to say yes. And ironically, actually, I emailed my quote unquote list. I didn't have a big list at the time, maybe 1,000 people. And I attached a flyer. That's how I sold this thing. I didn't even have a sales page for it. I didn't have a checkout for it. I said, hey, take a look at the attached flyer and let me know if you're interested. And I was lucky enough to get 14 people and I made $17,000 and paid Rachel. I was ecstatic. So before I even started coaching with my mentor, she taught me resourcefulness, right? She taught me resourcefulness. I talked to so many people in the DMs who were like, Jill, I would love to do FBA. I'm saving up for FBA. Here's the deal. You don't have to save up for FBA. You can literally launch something to make that money right now. Like FBA, our like lowest price point is $1,500 to me. And we have like a bunch of different financing options. So if you're thinking about that, you don't have to be like, let me go ahead and save for that. If you want to, that's fine. But get resourceful and go, how can I make $1,500 online in the next 30 days? What does that look like? How many one-on-one clients is that? Do I have to put together an ebook? Can I run a challenge? Like, how can I get resourceful? And that was the first thing that Rachel taught me without even knowing it. Then we spent a year together. And while I learned a ton about business and numbers and things like that, the mentorship I was in with Rachel and her husband, Alan, was a lot for like business gym owners. And so because I didn't own a gym, a lot of those things didn't necessarily apply to me. So some of the biggest things that I did learn from Rachel had to do with mindset. They were massive mindset shifts. Both her and Alan were running a super successful business, multiple successful businesses. They were established within the industry. They were writing in magazines. They had books out. And so I learned so much just from a mindset perspective. And it elevated me from coach, content creator, blogger to really a business owner, right? And what we call a digital CEO. And so the first thing that she taught me was, and this is one of my greatest lessons to this day, which is act like you don't need the sale. And this one for me was such a huge insight at the time, and continues to be something that I draw on, especially if I start to feel in scarcity. So actually, this is a conversation I was having with Rachel right before I was getting ready to go on a webinar, and I was going to sell a $5,000 offer on the webinar, and I was terrified. I was so scared to sell. I had sold before in like a previous webinar, and I like ran through it, and I remember just going to Rachel like, wow, I've never sold something that's expensive. And I got to tell you, I'm having like imposter syndrome, right? Like, am I good enough to charge this? Of course, this is the highest ticket thing I had ever sold. And Rachel just said to me, Jill, go on the webinar and act like you don't need the sale. And it was such a small thing, such like an offhanded comment, something I would tell my clients now, but it just was the thing that I needed in the moment. And I remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, Jill, you don't have these clients already, right? Like you don't have them already. So you might as well go out there, deliver tremendous value, and then detach from the outcome. And for me, a lot of times when we feel in scarcity, it's because we're trying to control the outcome. We're trying to squeeze it so hard. We have to make money. And like, we're coming into this space as a business owner, operating in scarcity, anxiety, desperation, and it's repellent, right? Those energy, that desperate energy is repellent, that like, I need this to work. Those are the times when you probably don't have your most successful launches because you're trying to control everything. And when it comes to business, like you're only one side of the street. The other side of the street is your customer, which is why we spend so much time talking about knowing your customer, knowing your ideal client avatar, knowing how they think, etc., because it's your job to get in their head. But all you can control is what you do on your side of the street. And so Rachel saying, act like you don't need the sale, I certainly had control over how I showed up on that webinar, how I showed up in abundance. And if you've ever worked with me, you know that like that's one of our core values at JillFit is abundance. There's enough to go around. Talk about scarcity. If you have an in-person business, that's when you should feel scarcity, right? You're sort of limited by the geographical region that you're in, how many people are in that neighborhood, the people who walk through the door at the gym. Meanwhile, online, are you kidding me? There's more clients, there's more money, there's more success, there's more than you could ever imagine to go around. And so if there's anywhere we can be in abundance, it's online. So act like you don't need the sale. It was tremendous business advice at the time, and it continues to be even life advice now. The second thing that I learned from Rachel was take responsibility for every little thing in your life. Now, I know this sounds sort of, remember you guys, this is back in 2012. There wasn't a ton of Instagram wasn't around yet. There weren't a ton of people talking about positive psychology and, radical responsibility and some of these things. But I remember this struck me because I was on board with take responsibility for your own stuff, right? I could get on board with that. I had gone through some personal development stuff. I had read some books, and I was like, yeah, I get that. But Rachel took it one step further. She said, take responsibility for your own actions, but also take responsibility for situations you find yourself in that weren't of your doing. Now, this was so challenging. This was so challenging because oftentimes we do find ourselves in situations that it's not because of something we did. It's something that maybe someone in our life did, or a family member, a friend, relationship. I went through, you guys, I think you probably know this, but I went through infidelity and divorce with my ex-husband. And I was so resentful for such a long time because I was like, I didn't do this, right? Yeah, it was like maybe somehow we came together at some time, but I remember feeling so just helpless, this thing was done to me, until I remembered Rachel and I was like, you know what? I didn't do this, but it affects me. And it's a part of the reason why I'm here in this space. So do I decide to take responsibility? Even if it quote unquote wasn't my fault, it's still my responsibility to figure something out, to take an action. I ended up leaving my marriage. I ended up moving across the country. I ended up doubling down on JillFit. Again, all of these things that weren't in my plans, but as a result of someone else's actions and where we found ourselves in our relationship, it was like, well, I got to figure something out. I can't be here and be the one everything is being done to. I didn't feel good being the victim. I think some people like to play up the victim role. For me, that was the worst feeling in the world. So taking responsibility for your own actions, but also taking responsibility for a situation you find yourself in that wasn't your fault. And this sucks because it feels really unfair. But at the end of the day, if you want to make progress, if you want to learn, if you want to succeed, you have to take radical responsibility for everything that happens in your life. Now, especially as you start bringing on team members, right? Team members may do some things that, you wouldn't have done. They'll miss things that maybe you wouldn't have missed, but that's part of the process, is training them, allowing for there to be some wiggle room for them to learn, to maybe make some mistakes, and for you to be that leader and be that manager who they feel comfortable sharing those experiences with. And so asking yourself, like, yes, I'm taking responsibility for the fact that I brought on a team member. I'm taking responsibility for the fact that maybe this person isn't 100% trained up yet. And so I'm taking responsibility for the fact that they may still make a mistake. And obviously that's not ideal, but when it does happen, which inevitably it will, because it's not you, and even you make mistakes, right? So then you take responsibility. And for me, at the end of the day, it's my business. And so if a team member fucks up or something goes wrong, goes sideways, I have to ultimately take responsibility for that. So then I ask myself, cool, how can we prevent this in the future? What do we need to do? What conversations do I need to have, etc.? So taking radical responsibility for everything is a place of power. One of my favorite statements or mottos is ownership brings options. When I own the situation, right? I'm not saying I blame myself, but when I own the situation, I have an opportunity to do something else. If I don't own the situation, then all of a sudden I feel helpless and I can't do anything. I can't affect change. And so taking responsibility for everything that happens, whether it's your quote unquote fault or someone else's, to me, that is the ultimate in empowerment. The next thing that Rachel taught me, and this is massive, she said, we teach people how to treat us. Now, Rachel is someone who she also sort of taught me that people respect those with boundaries. And I was terrible at boundaries, especially the first couple of years at JillFit, because we were doing one-on-one coaching. And I remember constantly blaming our clients, like, don't they know it's Sunday night? They're texting us all hours of the day, right? And it was because we hadn't put the boundaries in place. We hadn't taught them what was acceptable. This became sort of my religion after that. I was like, yes, if I'm interacting with someone in a way that I don't like, it is my responsibility to change that. People will do whatever you let them do. And it's not because they're malicious. It's not because they're a bad person. But if you allow for them to, if you have coached them for free in your DMs, they're going to keep asking for free coaching in your DMs and not purchase something from you. And so you have to look at how you're showing up in those spaces, whether it's with potential clients or actual clients or family members or friends, and say, how am I allowing this? How am I enabling this? And early days in JillFit, we definitely had some moments where our clients were texting us like dozens, if not hundreds of times a day. And I was like, God, I could either blame them for like not knowing, or I could take responsibility for this and like put some boundaries in place and have some conversations, have some uncomfortable conversations. But I need to take responsibility for the fact that it is my job to teach them how to interact with us. And it's not, again, because they're bad or they're wrong or we're right or anything like that. It's just like, if I don't like a situation, how do you know? How do you know if you don't like a situation? How do you know if you are not liking the scenario that you're in and it's time to take responsibility? You're probably going to feel things like resentment, right? Irritation, annoyance. I know for me, if I haven't taken enough downtime, if I haven't taken enough recharge time, I start to feel those ways. And I don't blame anyone else. I don't blame my partner. I don't blame my friends, my family, my clients. I don't blame them. I blame myself. And I go, okay, Jill, like, you need to take responsibility for this. Where are your energetic leaks? You're showing up in this feeling resentful or annoyed or irritated. That's your job. So if you don't like how an interaction is going with someone in your life, it's your job to change your actions or to have a difficult conversation and have the courage to do that. I think a lot of times we don't put boundaries in place because we're scared of people thinking we're a bitch, or that we're like, I don't know, that we think we're too good or something like that. But at the end of the day, the boundary isn't about punishing them. The boundary is about maintaining your own mental and emotional energy. And really, at the end of the day, to grow your business, you're going to have a lot more output. Think about some of the challenges you have come up now in your business, whether it's a beginning business, whether it's an intermediate or advanced business. As your business grows and as you start scaling and as you start dealing with more and more customers, right? We talk about bringing in more money. You're going to have to deal with more customers and different personalities. You got to lock it down. You got to figure this out now when your business is smaller, so that as you grow, you can continue having these boundaries in place. The next thing Rachel taught me was how to cultivate high self-worth constantly. And in other words, this was mostly around like, how can I continue evolving as a leader? How can I continue growing as a content creator, or as a professional? And if I'm cultivating high self-worth, that means, am I investing in myself, in my personal growth? Am I investing in the business, right? Am I listening to podcasts? Am I reading books? Am I staying up on what's going on in our space? Am I attending live events? Anytime you feel in scarcity, or you start to feel like, I don't know, maybe you start to feel a level of irrelevance, or maybe you start to feel like you're not on the pulse of like your clients, or maybe you're not doing a good job and you're having this imposter syndrome, oftentimes it's because you're not on the pulse of what's going on. And so for me, that's one of the biggest things about cultivating high self-worth is I'm reading, I'm listening, I'm going to live events, I'm seeking out experts, I'm learning from experts. Right? I'm constantly evolving and getting better as a professional. When I'm doing those things and cultivating high self-worth, you can bet I'm going to show up in my conversations confident and competent and with mastery and proficiency over the material. So I'm not going to feel insecure because I know that I'm doing my due diligence constantly. This is why I'm such a huge fan of not only investment, but continuing education and continuing to learn and grow and show up at live events and be in the trenches of your industry. You can do it so easily, but so many of us don't because it costs money, or it costs time, or it costs effort, or it's hard. But at the end of the day, the people who have the most success are constantly staying up on and cultivating a level of high self-worth so they can show up in these containers confident and competent and get their clients results. The last thing that I learned, and this wasn't exactly from Rachel, but this was as a result of being in the mastermind with Rachel,